Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Mercy. What do you think of when you hear the word mercy? It's a bit funny to admit, but when I started thinking about the word mercy in preparation for this sermon, I came to mind this quite brutal game that we used to play in primary school. I don't know if you have it here, but it's basically you kind of come up to a friend and put your hands out and interlock fingers and just try to hurt each other. And the first person that can't handle it anymore and says mercy loses the game, but then the pain stops. We often talk about cry mercy, like somebody will cry mercy, make the pain stop. And so is that what Jesus was talking about when he said, "Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy"? Is it about making pain stop? I think on some level it is, but I don't think it's quite as simple as that. So most of you know that 2 days a week I work as a therapist. I mostly do trauma therapy and anxiety treatment for children, adolescents, and adults. So on the average day, quite a lot of my brain space is taken up in finding the intersection between what I know as a therapist, both in learned knowledge and in observations in my clients, and what we know from the big story of God that's found in the Bible. So I'm going to take you on a bit of a journey today, a bit of that journey that I often go through in my own head, mostly because I don't actually know how to talk about mercy without talking about all of this that I'm about to share. We're going to start that journey in the Bible, in Genesis. I'm going to give you a quite a gross summary of Genesis to get us to the points that I want to highlight. Genesis 1 begins, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And darkness and light, water and sky, land, vegetation, animals. And God said that it was good." And then God created humankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. And God saw all that he had made and said, it was very good. And Adam and Eve were both naked in the garden, and they felt no shame. God said, "You shall not eat of the fruit of the tree in the middle of the garden, or you will die." But Eve took of its fruit and ate, and she also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate. And then the eyes of both were opened, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves loincloths. And they heard the sound of God walking in the garden, and they hid themselves from the presence of God. God called out to them and said, "Where are you?" And Adam said, "I heard the sound of you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked. And so I hid myself." And God said, "Who told you that you were naked?" See, prior to this moment, God knew the difference between good and evil. And human beings, we just lived within that truth, within God's truth. They knew that they were very good and there was no shame. But when Adam and Eve ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, shame entered the world. Okay, so what does that mean? Shame is one of 4 human emotions in a family of emotions that we call the emotions of self-conscious affect. And so that's the group of emotions that we feel when we feel self-conscious. The other 3 emotions in that family are guilt, embarrassment, and humiliation. Now, they're all quite connected and similar, so understandably we often use these words interchangeably. But they're not actually the same, and shame is quite significantly different than the rest of them. Because shame is the only human emotion that tells us something bad about ourselves. So while guilt is the emotion that we feel when we think, "Oh shoot, I did something bad there, made a mistake," shame is the emotion that we feel when we think, "I am bad, I'm not good, I'm weak, I'm not enough, I'm too much for the people around me, and we can all fill in the blank, because we all have a narrative of shame in our lives. We have all felt that emotion, and let me tell you, it's toxic and it's evil. And so when Adam and Eve were in the garden and they felt no shame, They were naked, and it was fine because they knew that what God had created was good. And when shame entered into the world, we no longer believed that truth in the same way. We began to fear that we were actually bad. Shame entering the world is the beginning of human beings deciding for themselves what is good and what is evil. And out of that, brokenness happened in relationships. There's brokenness in our relationship with God, brokenness in our relationship with others, and brokenness in our relationship with ourselves. Now stay with me. I'm going to get back to mercy, I promise. Okay, so now what emotion researchers know about shame is that what shame needs to grow is secrecy, silence, and judgment. It thrives in the darkness. It gains strength in the dark corners of our mind where it can hide from anything that might challenge its truth. So that's what it needs to thrive. So what does shame need to die? What is the antidote to shame? The antidote to shame is empathy. When somebody can look at our shame and say, I see how that feels so hard for you. I get it. And also, you aren't bad. In fact, you're so very, very good. That's what kills shame. When our shame can be brought out of the dark into the light, it can't survive. That's remarkable, isn't it? That the expert understanding of how our emotions work so closely aligns with the biblical concept of darkness and light. So how does all this relate to mercy? Okay, now I didn't read this anyway. This is my own definition of mercy, so there may very well be some flaws in it. But I think that mercy is when we look at another person and say, I get it. I see what you're doing. I see how evil is so hard to overcome, and in ways it's very much in charge in your life, but still, you aren't bad. In fact, you are very good. So I want to read to you from a bit later in Matthew. This is after the Beatitudes, which is where we have been in our sermon series. Matthew 23, this is verse 13, and then we are going to skip to verse 23 and end with verse 26. So verse 13 says, Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You shut the doors of the kingdom of heaven in people's faces. You yourselves do not enter, nor will you let those enter who are trying to. In verse 23, Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you tithe mint and dill and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. These you ought to have done without neglecting the others. You blind guides, straining out a gnat and swallowing a camel. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! You clean the outside of the cup and the plate, but inside they are full of greed and self-indulgence. You blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup and the plate, that the outside also may be clean. Jesus doesn't mince words when he lets the Pharisees know what he thinks about how they're managing things. The Pharisees are living into the belief that they get to be the judges of what's good and what's evil. And Jesus doesn't like that very much. It's a direct effect of the sin that Jesus came to die for. And in another passage in Matthew, this is Matthew 9, verses 10 to 13. And as Jesus reclined at the table in the house, behold, many tax collectors and sinners came and were reclining with Jesus and his disciples. And when the Pharisees saw this, they said to his disciples, Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners? But when he heard it, he said, Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice, for I came not to call the righteous, but sinners. But the slightly ironic part of this is even the righteous are sinners, right? Every human being except Jesus is a sinner. The righteous are just acting like they're not. So what Jesus is really saying here is that I came to call those who admit their sin and who are vulnerable with the truth about their lives. Those are the people that I want to hang out with. So this concept is clearly deep in the heart of Jesus. He doesn't want us to judge. He wants us to love. Now, this doesn't mean that he wants us to ignore evil in this world, but he wants us to be able to say to people, no matter who they are or what they've done, you are good, and I love you. Remember, part of what shame needs to survive is judgment. When we choose not to judge, we are choosing not to live out of the effects of the sin in the world. We are choosing to not say, oh, I see what you made, God, when you made that person, but I actually think they're bad. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Because this act, this choosing to separate the goodness of God's creation from the sin that ravages it, is the very essence of the cross and the very essence of Jesus' life. He went about ministry telling people, I see what you've done. I see the sin in your life, but you are so very good. So good, in fact, that I will give my life for yours. So how do we do this? How do we bring our shame to the light? How do we show empathy? How do we not judge and choose to love? How do we become merciful? To answer that question for us as a church family, I'd say it has to begin with us. I would guess it's probably safe to say that a large portion of the community around us who don't know Jesus don't see the church as a place that's full of merciful people. I think a lot of people think that the church is all about judgment. So we should definitely work on that reputation and show mercy to all. But also, let's not be hypocrites. Let's start by showing mercy to one another. Now, I told you that empathy is the antidote to shame. And empathy is an act of mercy, a very powerful act of mercy. Ultimately, it's Jesus who extends mercy to all of us, but by seeing people for the good that they are, despite their sin, we are opening the doors for them to the kingdom of God. And the way that we can develop and grow and strengthen a culture of empathy, mercy, and non-judgment in this place, in this whānau, is by first being willing to receive mercy. Empathy is the antidote to shame, but the pathway to empathy is vulnerability. We need to be vulnerable with one another. We need to not hide bits of ourselves from those around us because we deep down believe that we are bad. We need to bear our shame within the church and allow those around us to empathize and remind us of God's mercy and of the truth that God made us and said, we are very good.